Well, tonight we finish off our last session of Spring Connection 2023, and it has been a filling weekend. And Nick, we really thank you for all the work that you've put in, the study that you've put in, and the time that you've spent with us. And I didn't have to get up here to introduce you because you've been here long enough. I think we already filled out a membership card for him, I'm pretty sure. So we'll notify Mount Morris for you. It'll be all right. But brother, it's really been great having you here, and look forward to seeing you again real soon. Preach the word.
Thank you, brother. The people at Mount Morris might have a bone to pick with y'all if you go through with that. It is really good to be with you once again. I appreciate all of the hospitality that has been shown my way. Helplessness is one of the absolute worst feelings that a person can feel. Once when I was a kid, I was probably, 6 or 7 years old. It's been a long time ago. My mother's family, we were at a get-together at my grandparents' house, and my grandparents, they had this place, in fact, they still have it, my grandpa does, up in Mansalona, Michigan. And it's way up north, if you don't know where that's at, up by Gaylord and Grayling in that area. And their house, it sat on about, it's 15 acres now, but it was probably 20 or 25 back then. I don't remember. He sold some of it, but out of that acreage that he had, probably 95% of it was just woods. And so they just have this house out in the middle of the woods. And when I was a kid, it was my absolute favorite place to be because it's peaceful out there. You could go and set up a hammock, and it's just you and the birds out there, and it's fantastic. But on this occasion, and I don't remember the occasion, it might have been a holiday, it might have been a birthday, it might have been a just because family get-together, and I don't know what we were doing, but for a moment, terror came upon our family. I have an older brother. His name is KJ. He's 27. I'm 26. We're about a year and a half apart. And he has autism. And at that moment in time, you can't get him to be quiet now, but back then he was nonverbal. And he wandered off a lot. He still does that, but I don't remember exactly what we were doing, if we were sitting around, maybe a campfire, maybe, I don't know, but my mother noticed that my brother had wandered off. And we're out there in these woods. And just about any wild animal you could think of in northern Michigan is out there. Bear and coyotes and all of that. And so we assumed that he had wandered off in the woods, because where else would he have went? And from there, it was all hands on deck trying to find my brother. So we split into groups looking for him. And as I remember it, and this is roughly 20 years ago, so my memory may not be completely accurate, but how I remembered, I went with 2 of my cousins. Why I didn't go with an adult, I don't know. But I went with 2 of my cousins. One was about 16 or 17, so he knew those woods pretty well. And then the other one was about my age, maybe a little older. And the 3 of us were out in the woods looking, and before I knew it, I got distracted, probably some shiny object or something. And next thing I know, I'm lost in the woods. And I'm out there by myself. And so now there's 2 missing Franklin children, not just the one. And I can look back and I can laugh at it now because I think, boy, I don't know. But I remember in that moment being perhaps as scared as I've ever been. Because first off, I'm already worried about my big brother. And I know he had autism, and it just didn't bode well for me. But now I'm worried about myself. And it didn't help that my grandparents liked to mess with us about the bear. We had a camper, me and my cousins did, and we would camp it on their property, and we'd sleep in that camper. Well, one year, my grandmother, she came out and she pretended that she was spreading honey on the camper, trying to attract the bear. This is the kind of shenanigans that I grew up with. And so I'm all worried about bears and coyotes and this, that, and the other thing. And they probably would have liked to have had little 6 or 7-year-old me for dinner. And as I remembered, and it could be that I'm over-dramatizing it, but I just remember running around frantically and looking for civilization. in what felt like an eternity, but really was probably about 5 or 10 minutes, I gave up. I found a spot and I sat. And I was certain that the bear was going to come and snatch me at any moment. In that moment, I was hopeless. I had no way to get back. I didn't know where I was. I was tired. I was emotionally drained. And in my mind, there was no way that I could get out of that situation. After sitting down for probably about 30 seconds, one of my uncles found me, and he told me, hey, they found your brother. They called him on his cell phone. We had those back then. They weren't the iPhones, but it was those good old-fashioned flip phones. And he relayed the news to me that somehow KJ actually found his way back to the house. He essentially just went in a circle, I guess. I think he was smarter than we gave him credit for. And since then, since I felt that feeling of complete hopelessness, I've tried my best to my ability to not have that feeling again. That feeling of when all hope is abandoned, even though in reality I was going to be fine, that feeling was not pleasant, and I would not recommend it at all. It seems that hope being abandoned has become a growing trend in our society. The Center for Disease Control, in addition to offering guidance for various diseases and so on, they do a lot of research and they follow a lot of trends. And before the COVID-19 pandemic, this was probably what the CDC was best known for, was a lot of the research that they did, in particular the different trends. And in their research over the last 20 years, from 2000 to 2020, the rate of suicide in our nation has increased, and it has especially been increasing when you look at the age demographic among our younger generations, the Generation Z people, the people who are teenagers right now. That number continues to increase. If you pull up the data and you look at the graph, from year to year, it will occasionally go down, but the trend is overall upward. So it looks kind of like this, or it's going up, but it's kind of a zigzag. And it's interesting, you look at these findings, and the big takeaway that the CDC was reporting was how from 2018 to 2020, the number had actually decreased. But in the last 20 years, the number has still seen an upward trend. It's getting to the point where a lot of us know someone who has taken their own life. In fact, many of us have known very close people who have taken their own life. And when that happens, it's especially difficult for us to cope with that. Even Christians sometimes take their own lives. I've known some who have. And I'm not going to claim to know why this happens, why people take their own life, or why this trend has continued to go upward over the last few decades. But one thing that I think we can observe through all of this is that people who do this, they have abandoned all hope. They see no way out. They don't see any good coming out of the circumstances that they're in. It's inconceivable to them. And they tragically decide that all hope is abandoned. And it seems that this too is a growing trend in our nation and in our society, the abandonment of hope. Oftentimes the storms of life come raining down on us, and they can be so overwhelming. It can be easy to just abandon any sort of hope and just let the waters come and consume us. It can seem at times that there's no way out. You get that notice that you've been laid off from work, and you've got mouths to feed. You have bills to pay, but suddenly you don't have any money coming in. Or you get that life-changing diagnosis, and it's treatable, but the treatment is gruesome. But the disease or the condition is also gruesome, so it's gruesome either way. Or you wake up in the middle of the night and your fire alarm is going off, and you have just enough time to get yourself and your family out, and now you stand in the street and you watch all of your possessions engulfed in flames. Sometimes the storms in life are mild. Sometimes they're catastrophic. Not so much a drizzle as much as it is a hurricane or a typhoon. If you've been through storms like this, or if you're currently going through a storm like this, and you're tempted to abandon all hope, let me encourage you this evening with a story about a storm that we read of in our Bibles. We read in Acts 27 about a literal storm, one that leads to a shipwreck with the Apostle Paul on board. We'll be reading from there in a moment if you want to be turning there, Acts 27. But before we get there, I want to set the context for what it is that we're going to read. We'll start in verse 13. And I usually do this in my sermons because these things that we read in these sacred scriptures, they don't take place in a vacuum. There's always a context that we need to know and that we need to understand if we want to come away with a better understanding of what the Bible says. To this point in the book of Acts, it has been largely following the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul. What he's been doing, and by and large what the book of Acts is about, is taking the gospel of Jesus Christ into all the world. It started in Jerusalem at the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. And then from there they went into some of the neighboring areas, into Judea and into Samaria. And now mostly following the Apostle Paul, the gospel is being taken to the ends of the earth. Paul has been to many different cities and different provinces. He has made many disciples. But there was one place that Paul desired to go to where he had not yet been, and that place was Rome. God also wanted Paul to go to Rome. And so as you read through some of the later chapters in the book of Acts, especially once Paul is on trial, first before Felix and then later before Festus, what we see happening through these interactions is that Paul, first, he is testifying about the gospel before these very powerful men. And he even does so before King Agrippa. And King Agrippa, you remember what he told him? He said, "You almost make me a Christian." But then we also see here, God is working behind the scenes. He's pulling the strings. He's orchestrating a situation where Paul will be able to travel to Rome without having to put up any of his own money. So while Paul is on trial before Festus, he utilizes one of his rights as a Roman citizen, a right to appeal to Caesar. Meaning now Paul would have to stand trial before the emperor in Rome. And so starting at the beginning of Acts 27, Paul and some of the others, Luke, our author, is there with them, they are shipping out to Rome from Caesarea. Before we read of the shipwreck, there's a detail that we read of before in this chapter that I want to draw to your attention. As they've been sailing along, the seasons are beginning to change, and the weather is beginning to become less and less suitable for traveling by boat. Despite some of the conditions that they had, they eventually find themselves at a place that's known as the Fair Havens, and it's near the city of Lycia. A lot of time has passed since they initially left. In fact, the Day of Atonement is now behind them. And that means it's getting into the late fall or the early winter. And this trip is getting more and more dangerous by the day. So in this chapter, in verse 10, Paul warns them not to go any further. He tells them, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But they don't listen to Paul. And they decide to try to go just a little bit further into a harbor named Phoenix and spend the winter there. I point this out because oftentimes when we find ourselves in a shipwreck kind of a situation, it can oftentimes be attributed to ourselves not listening to some of the godly counsel that we have in our life. How many times have we heard someone say, you probably shouldn't be doing that? But then we do it and then it ends very poorly. If only we'd just listen, right? So that takes us to verse 13 of this chapter. Let's read a few verses together. Acts 27, starting in verse 13. Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. It's interesting, this section in verse 13, it begins with them thinking that everything is just as they want, despite what Paul had told them previously. They look and they see that the wind is blowing in the direction that they want, and so they don't have far to go. They're just going probably about 45 miles or so. And so they think they have what they want, and they sail along the shore of Crete. And this is an important fact that they're along the shore because it's shallow waters out there. And the reason for that is probably because the wind was blowing so gently. They couldn't get very far out. And so they're very close to the shore and they're in very shallow waters, and that's going to be at play when they eventually shipwreck. And for reference, where they're going is probably about the distance from here to Ann Arbor, about 45 miles. And as they're sailing along, they think it's going fine when suddenly a tempestuous wind, known as the northeaster, struck down from the land. And all of a sudden, this gentle southern wind was a violent northeastern wind blowing against them. And this wind, it's so violent and it's so severe that their boat cannot face it. So instead of trying to resist the wind, they give way to it and are driven along. And so now things are starting to get desperate. They're scurrying to try to secure the ship. They're trying to prevent it from running aground. And it eventually gets to the point where they have to start throwing things overboard. First their cargo, then their tackle, and then towards the end of the chapter, they're going to even throw their grain overboard. That's the whole reason that they're going to Rome in the first place, is transporting this grain. When you get to verse 20, things are hopeless. There had been no sun. There hadn't even been any stars. They'd been in darkness this whole time. And they've had no relief from the tempest that was being laid on them. And as Luke says here, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. These people have abandoned all hope. They don't see a way out of this. In their minds, there's no perceivable way that they can make it out of this situation alive. What a devastating feeling that must have been. But as we read on, despite being in a hopeless situation, despite all of their hope being abandoned, there's still a reason to have hope. If you're following along still in Acts 27, we're going to pick back up in verse 21. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God of whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told." This situation, it continues to become more and more dire by the minute. So Paul now intervenes and begins speaking to them. He starts by giving them the old-fashioned "I told you so." He tells them, "You should have listened to me when we were back there. I warned you about this, and you didn't listen, and look where we are now." And it's interesting because usually when someone's giving you the "I told you so" treatment, they're either messing around or they're rubbing something in your face in almost a facetious way. But Paul is genuine here. And what he's doing is he's building credibility as if he needs it, right? They should have listened to him the first time, but he's building up credibility for what he's going to say next. I was right before, I'm right now, and you need to listen to what I have to say. And what he tells them is this. He says, "Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship." All their hope of being saved has been abandoned. But now Paul tells them to take heart or to have courage. They must have been thinking, "Paul, we're not getting out of this alive. Why in the world should we have courage?" Well, they were going to get out of it alive. They'd lose just about everything else, including the ship, but they were going to be spared their lives. They've had all of their hope abandoned. But just because they've abandoned their hope, that does not mean that there's not something to be hopeful for. In the midst of the tempestuous and the violent winds, and the chaos and the terror of being in the thick of a storm, they've lost sight of their hope and thought that there was no possible way of getting out of this alive. But they were wrong. Paul reminds them of the hope that they had before them, the hope that they would be able to go to Rome. As Paul says here, an angel of the Lord told him that very night that he is going to stand before Caesar. And so because Paul was going to end up in Rome, the rest of them are also going to end up in Rome. And so with all of that in mind, with their hope which has been abandoned back in focus, Paul tells them again in verse 25, "Take heart, men." Here once again, Paul tells them to take courage. Make no mistake about it, they were going to need some courage in order to overcome what they needed to overcome. They had quite a storm that they were going to have to weather. And as the story continues on after verse 25, they continue to get close and closer to land. They let down 4 anchors so as to not run on the rock, and they pray for day to come. And brethren, day did come. And although, as Paul said, they did lose the ship, they all made it safely to dry land on the island of Malta. But when Paul is telling them this, they didn't know what would come. They didn't know if the day would ever come. Or they didn't know if they would make it as Paul was telling them. But Paul tells them, he says, "I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I've been told." This doesn't make things easy, and it doesn't make the storms go away, and that doesn't mean that things will go away when we want them to go. But in the end, God was faithful to them. And despite them having abandoned all of their hope in being saved, they were saved. So after reading all of that, what does that say about us? Well, like they were, oftentimes we find ourselves in a tumultuous storm with the tempest raging against us. And we can sometimes do as they did and go into a panic. And as they did, sometimes we can abandon all of our hope. But just because hope seems lost to us, that doesn't mean that hope is lost. Because our hope is in the Lord. You may be thinking, well, Nick, you don't even know me. You've been here, 2 days? You don't know the things that I've done, or you don't know the things that I'm going through. And you're right, I don't. But I do know this, that God, the one who does know you, that knows everything about you, He knows what you're going through. And He is faithful. He is steadfast. He is immovable. And He is dependable. Even when hope is lost, even when the storm engulfs us, He is still faithful to us, even when we are not faithful to Him. Paul had faith in the Lord. He had faith that God would do exactly as He said He would, and He did. God has proven time and time again to be faithful to His word. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7, starting in verse 24, Jesus, in conclusion to what is a masterful sermon, He tells His disciples a parable about how to respond to His words. He starts by telling them of a wise man who built his house on the rock. He said, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. That person, according to Jesus, is the one who hears His words and does them. But the one who hears His words and does not do them, according to Jesus, that person is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. Jesus said, the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it. Now, it's in its context, Jesus is using this parable in reference specifically to His teachings from this sermon. But I think this parable from the Lord, it serves as a great illustration in light of this evening's lesson. Jesus states it as a matter of fact that storms will come and they will threaten the house. And the house that's built on the sand, it will not be able to withstand the storms. But the one whose house is built on the rock, that person's house will stand. I think the same can be said of us. It is a certainty of life that there will be storms. Some will be non-threatening, but others will be life-changing. And it can be easy to do as they did in Acts 27 on that ship and abandon all hope. But let me remind you of what the Apostle Paul told them. He told them to have courage, to take heart, and to have faith that God will do as He said He will do. And even if the storms of this life overcome us and we succumb to them, let me remind you of the hope that we have in a life after this one. Jesus, in going to the cross, bearing our sins and dying there, He has given us this hope. This hope stands today for those who have obeyed the gospel, those who have believed in the Lord, who have confessed Him before man, who have repented of their sins, and who have been immersed in water for the forgiveness of those sins. If you find yourself without this hope, or if at one point you had this hope and you have done as the men in the ship have done and abandoned it, if you have not been faithful to our Lord, won't you come and won't you be welcomed back into the fold? If you are without this hope, the Lord invites you to come and to partake in it. Heed this invitation as we stand and as we sing.